Welcome back to our channel. Bon Scott was the wild beast of AC/DC, the one who turned Highway to Hell into an immortal anthem of rock and roll. But behind that roar was a body consumed by alcohol for a decade, a slow suicide that no one could stop. Then, after one night of heavy drinking at Music Machine, the king was abandoned in a cold car in the middle of a London winter. Today we must confront a haunting question. Why, the next morning, was Bon Scott found dead, curled up alone and desperate, in that cramped Renault 5? The trajectory of the man in the Renault 5 was set 30 years prior. Born in grey post-war Scotland, the real trauma struck in 1952 when his family migrated to the scorching heat of Australia. Bullied for his size and accent, young Ronald Scott learned that violence was the only language respected in the schoolyard. He killed his sensitive self to construct Bon, a weaponized persona of fearlessness. This path led him to the Riverbank Detention Center in 1963, a university of hardness, where he learned to mask vulnerability with a sneer. But his first taste of fame was a humiliation. Before AC/DC, the street fighter was forced to dress as a clown in the bubblegum pop band, the Valentines. Wearing satin and singing sugary songs, he felt like a fraud. To survive this daily indignity, he found a chemical solution. Alcohol became his tool, not for pleasure, but to silence the screaming imposter syndrome in his head. By 1974, the Valentines were dead, and his subsequent band, Fraternity, was stalling. Bon was 27 years old. In the youth-obsessed calendar of rock music, he was already geriatric. He was broke. He was living in Adelaide, scraping by, his dreams of global domination fading into the grim reality of the pub circuit. He was working odd jobs. He was a laborer. He was painting ships. The glamorous life was a lie. He was back where he started, only older and more tired. Then came the event that should have ended his life 6 years early, the event that served as a brutal biological warning shot. February 1974, Adelaide. Bon was riding his Suzuki GT550 motorcycle. He was, as usual, intoxicated. He had argued with members of his band. He was angry, drunk, and speeding through the darkness. He collided with a car. The physics of the crash were devastating. Bon was launched from the bike. He hit the asphalt with catastrophic force. This was not just a crash, it was the biological prologue to his death. The injuries were not just superficial. He suffered severe head trauma. He spent 3 days in a coma. But the most gruesome injury, and the one that would haunt his self-image forever, was to his face. His jaw was shattered. His teeth were destroyed. When he woke up in the hospital, the golden god was a broken collection of bones and tubes. The doctors had to reconstruct his mouth. He lost his front teeth and was fitted with dentures. Psychologically, this was a devastation. Bon's entire persona was built on virility, on physical dominance, on being the cock of the walk. Now he was a toothless invalid. He had to look in the mirror and see a gummy-scarred ruin. For a man whose self-worth was already fragile, this was a confirmation of his deepest fears, that he was ugly, that he was damaged goods. But there was a deeper physiological consequence. The coma and the severe head trauma had undoubtedly caused subtle neurological damage. The brain is not a rubber ball. It does not bounce back perfectly. The neural pathways are altered. Impulse control is weakened. The chemistry of mood regulation is disrupted. Post-accident, Bon's drinking accelerated. This is a common pattern in trauma survivors. The alcohol becomes a way to self-medicate the physical pain of the recovery and the psychological pain of the near-death experience. He was drinking to numb the memory of the asphalt, and there was the physical reality of the dentures. He was ashamed of them. He developed a habit of grinning in a way that hid the gum line or not smiling at all, adopting a menacing closed-mouth scowl that people mistook for toughness. It wasn't toughness, it was vanity and shame. He was a 28-year-old man with a broken body, a false set of teeth, a criminal record, and a failed career. He was working as a driver and general muscle for other bands, watching from the side of the stage as younger men lived his dream. He was at rock bottom. He was ripe for a savior or a devil. He found both in the form of two diminutive Scottish brothers. The meeting between Bon Scott and AC/DC is often mythologized as destiny. In reality, it was a meeting of desperate needs. Malcolm and Angus Young were guitar prodigies, fueled by a maniacal, disciplined ambition. They had the riffs, they had the energy, but they lacked a voice. Their current singer, Dave Evans, was a glam rock pretender who lacked the grit required for the sound Malcolm heard in his head. They needed a frontman who didn't just sing about trouble, but who looked like he caused it. Bon Scott needed a vehicle. He had the voice, a high-pitched sandpaper screech that was the sonic equivalent of a rusty razor blade. He had the lyrics, notebooks full of observations about dirty women, bad drugs, and prison time. But he had no band. When Bon auditioned for AC/DC in late 1974, it wasn't a polite affair. He was older than them. He walked into the room with the arrogance of a man who had nothing left to lose. He sneered at them. He told them they were playing too loud. But when he grabbed the microphone, the chemistry was instantaneous and volatile. It was the perfect fusion of the young brothers' disciplined, metronomic violence and Bon Scott's chaotic, drunken street poetry. Malcolm provided the skeleton, Bon provided the blood and the guts. But this union came with a hidden cost. The young brothers were relentless. They were workaholics. They did not drink before shows. They were precision instruments. To keep up with their intensity, to be the front man for the loudest, hardest working band in Australia, Bon had to turn his wild man dial up to 11. He wasn't just joining a band, he was stepping onto a treadmill that would not stop for 6 years. The Bon Scott persona was no longer just a shield, it was now a job description. He was required to be the drunkest, craziest guy in the room. It was his marketing hook. The industry, the fans, and even the band expected it. If Bon wanted a cup of tea and a quiet night in with a book, he couldn't have it. That wasn't what Bon Scott did. Bon Scott drank a bottle of bourbon and jumped off a balcony. He was trapped. He had finally achieved the success he craved, but the price of admission was the total surrender of his private self. He had to kill Ronald Scott to keep Bon Scott alive. As 1974 bled into 1975, the band began its grueling ascent through the Australian pub circuit. The year did not bring glamour, it brought attrition. A C/DC had secured a recording contract, but in the sprawling, unforgiving geography of Australia, a contract was merely a license to work yourself to death. The high-voltage era was defined by a specific brutal ecosystem, the bloodhouses. These were not concert halls. They were cavernous, tile-lined drinking barns designed to facilitate the rapid consumption of lager by hard men ending hard shifts in factories and mines. The acoustics were terrible and the air smelled of stale beer, cigarette ash, and violence. If you bored the audience, they threw full cans. If you insulted them, they stormed the stage. For a band like AC/DC, this was the forge. And for Bon Scott, it was the perfect environment to cement his new, lethal persona. On stage, screaming over the feedback with the sweat pouring down his chest, he was a king. But the moment the amp was turned off, the silence returned. And with the silence came the thirst. The voltage was being generated by a biological engine that was already running on fumes. Yet, this engine was about to be pushed beyond its red line. not in a sprint, but in a marathon of attrition that would grind the man down to his component parts. He was the ringmaster of this circus of aggression. While Angus Young, dressed in his schoolboy uniform, provided the visual gimmick and the kinetic frenzy, Bond provided the threat. He would stalk the stage with a peculiar menacing grace, a result of his short stature and the tight jeans that restricted his movement. He would lock eyes with the biggest, drunkest man in the front row and grin. It was a grin that said, "I am crazier than you. Do not test me." But the physical toll of this apprenticeship was immediate. The band was playing 2, sometimes 3 gigs a night. They would play a suburban pub at 7 p.m., pack the gear into a cramped transit van, drive across Sydney or Melbourne at breakneck speed, and play a city club at 11 p.m. Bond was the road warrior. He was the one loading the heavy Marshall stacks. He was the one driving the van while the young brothers slept. He was 10 years older than them, and he took on a strange dual role: the protective older brother and the irresponsible court jester. To maintain this inhuman schedule, the chemical intake increased, alcohol ceased to be a recreational substance and became a metabolic fuel. Physiologically, the human body is not designed to perform high-intensity aerobic activity for 90 minutes, then sit in a cramped, vibrating vehicle for 3 hours, then repeat the process, all while deprived of REM sleep. The body responds by flooding the system with cortisol, the stress hormone. To counteract the cortisol and the adrenaline, Bond used alcohol. It was a crude chemical lever. He needed the depressant effects of ethanol to force his nervous system to power down in the van. And then he needed the sugar and the dopamine spike of the drink to power back up for the next show. He was putting his endocrine system through a roller coaster of extreme spikes and crashes, 7 days a week. The damage during this period was not yet visible in the bloat of his later years, but it was cumulative. He was eroding his adrenal glands. He was teaching his brain that it could not regulate its own chemistry without external assistance. It was during this period of relentless grinding that Bond wrote the lyrics to "It's a Long Way to the Top." History remembers a victory anthem. The lyrics reveal a complaint letter. Stripped of nostalgia, it is a bleak accounting of his reality. Getting robbed, getting stoned, getting beat up, broken boned. Bond was not speaking metaphorically. He was literally getting beaten up. The violence of the pub circuit was real. He was getting robbed by promoters who shortchanged them. He was broken boned from the motorcycle crash and the roughhousing on stage. The song is a cry of exhaustion. It is the testimony of a man who realizes that the glitter he chased is actually just grime. The decision to include bagpipes in the song was Bond's idea, a nod to his Scottish heritage. But it was also a sonic manifestation of his primal wound. The bagpipes are an instrument of war and of mourning. By bringing them into a hard rock song, Bond was asserting his identity as the outsider, the Highlander in exile. It was a defiant signal that he was not just an Australian rocker. He was a man apart, carrying the melancholy of the old country in his lungs. The video for the song, filmed on the back of a flatbed truck moving down Swanston Street in Melbourne, captures the essence of the era. The band looks cool, yes, but look closer at Bond. He looks wiry, dangerous, and utterly committed. But there is a hardness in the eyes. He is almost 30. He is singing about the long way to the top because he knows statistically he shouldn't make it. He is too old. He is too damaged. He is running a race against time, and he can feel the clock ticking in his chest. In 1976, AC/DC made the strategic decision to move to London. They had conquered Australia, but Australia was an island. To be legends, they had to conquer the empire. This move was a massive psychological dislocation for Bond. He was leaving the sun-drenched familiarity of Australia, where he was a big fish in a small pond, to return to the gray, damp, hostile island of his birth. London in 1976 was not a welcoming place. It was a city in decay. There were strikes. There was rubbish piling up in the streets. The economy was collapsing, and culturally a war was brewing. Punk rock was exploding. The Sex Pistols, the Clash, and the Damned were tearing down the establishment. They preached anarchy, amateurism, and the destruction of the rock dinosaur. A C/DC landed right in the middle of this minefield. To the punks, AC/DC were old guard, they had long hair, they played guitar solos. They wanted to be stars. They were the enemy. To the classic rock press, AC/DC were crude primitive colonials making noise. They were hated by both sides. For Bon, this rejection was familiar territory. It triggered the old Riverbank Detention Center defiance. He didn't try to appease the London scene. He doubled down on his aggression. The band lived in a shared house in Barnes, West London. It was a squalid existence. They were broke. They slept on mattresses on the floor. The dampness seeped into their bones. For a recovering alcoholic, this environment was lethal. The boredom of poverty is the greatest trigger for addiction. There was nothing to do but wait for gigs, and nothing to drink but cheap beer and cider. Bon became the den mother of the house, cooking cheap meals for the young brothers, keeping morale up with his dark humor. But secretly, the isolation was eating him. He was back in the cold climate that his parents had fled. He felt the weight of his age even more acutely here. The punks were 19, Bon was 30. He felt like a relic before he had even peaked. This insecurity fueled a shift in his drinking habits. In Australia, beer was the staple, a high-volume, lower-alcohol beverage. In cold, expensive London, Bon began to gravitate toward spirits. Vodka and whiskey offered a faster, more efficient route to oblivion. They were warming. They were compact. You could hide a half bottle of vodka in a jacket pocket. You couldn't hide a crate of beer. This transition to hard liquor is a critical milestone in the progression of alcoholism. It changes the pharmacokinetics of intoxication. The blood alcohol concentration spikes much faster. The damage to the liver accelerates. The impact on the brain is more violent. To survive the London press, the band's management and label pushed a specific narrative. AC/DC were the bad boys. They were dangerous. They were criminals. Bon was the poster child for this campaign. The press releases highlighted his prison record. They highlighted the unlawful carnal knowledge charge. They painted him as a rapacious, violent beast. Bon played along. He gave interviews where he claimed to drink a bottle of whiskey for breakfast. He bragged about his conquests. He cultivated the image of the dirty deeds specialist. But this branding had a terrible psychological cost. It is what sociologists call labeling theory. If you treat a man like a monster and reward him for acting like a monster, he will eventually become the monster. Bon was trapped in a feedback loop. The more outrageous he acted, the more records they sold. The more records they sold, the more he was expected to be outrageous. He was incentivized to destroy himself. His lyrics from this period, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, the Jack Squealer, are often criticized for their misogyny. And they are misogynistic, but viewed through the forensic lens, they are also defensive. Bon wrote about women as objects, as adversaries, or as conquests because he was terrified of intimacy. Intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires letting someone see the man behind the mask, the man with the dentures, the scars, and the crushing anxiety. Bon couldn't afford that, so he reduced women to cartoons in his songs. The Jack isn't just a song about venereal disease. It's a song about the transactional, infected nature of his relationships. There was no love in Bond's world, only deeds. The Rosie incident is the prime example. Whole Lotta Rosie is a celebration of a sexual encounter with a morbidly obese Tasmanian woman. On the surface, it's a bawdy tavern song, but underneath, it reveals the loneliness of his life. Bond wasn't sleeping with supermodels. He was sleeping with whoever was available, whoever offered a moment of human warmth in the cold vacuum of the tour. He found connection in the margins of society because he felt he lived in the margins himself. By 1977, the band began to find its footing in the UK and Europe. The album Let There Be Rock was released. This album marks a sonic shift. It is heavier, faster, and darker than the previous records. The bubblegum influence of the early days was gone. This was pure, distilled aggression. But while the music was getting tighter, Bond was getting looser. The touring schedule for Let There Be Rock was inhumane. They were crisscrossing Europe, supporting bands like Black Sabbath. They were driving through blizzards, sleeping in freezing hotels, eating garbage food. Bond's physical deterioration began to manifest visibly. In photos from 1977, you can see the cushingoid puffiness starting to appear in his face, a sign of elevated cortisol and early-stage liver stress. His eyes often look glassy, the 1,000-yard stare of the functional alcoholic. The contrast between Bond and the Young brothers became stark. Angus and Malcolm were drinking tea and discussing chord progressions. They were focused. They were ambitious. They treated the band like a military operation. Bond treated it like a kamikaze mission. He began to miss sound checks. He would arrive at the venue minutes before stage time, stumbling, smelling of vodka. But, and this is the tragedy that enabled his addiction, the moment he stepped on stage, he delivered. The adrenaline would sober him up just enough to perform. He would scream, he would dance, he would mesmerize the crowd. This reinforced the functioning addict myth. The band tolerated his behavior because he did the job. They saw the drunk in the dressing room, but they saw the God on the stage. They assumed the God was the reality and the drunk was the anomaly. They were wrong. The drunk was the reality. The God was the anomaly. It was during this period that a darker shadow began to flirt with Bon Scott: heroin. The London rock scene in the late 70s was awash with opiates. While Bond was primarily an alcohol man, a pisshead in Australian parlance, he was an addictive personality in an environment where heroin was currency. There are conflicting reports about the extent of Bond's drug use. Some claim he dabbled, others claim he was terrified of needles. But the forensic context suggests that he was certainly using uppers to keep going during the exhausting tours and downers to sleep. He was chemical engineering his own consciousness. He was playing with the neurotransmitters in his brain like a child playing with matches. In 1977, there was an incident, often hushed up in official biographies, where Bond reportedly overdosed on heroin in Melbourne. He was revived. The band was terrified. This should have been the intervention point. This should have been the moment the machinery stopped. But the machine couldn't stop. They were on the verge of breaking America. The momentum was too great. The incident was swept under the rug. It was treated as a one-off, a mistake. Bond laughed it off. He was invincible, wasn't he? He was the guy who survived the motorcycle crash. He was the guy who drank bottles of whiskey and walked away. But the body remembers. The overdose would have placed immense strain on his heart, the same heart that was already struggling under the toxic load of daily alcohol abuse and the heavy smoking. Bon Scott's heart was becoming a ticking time bomb. The muscle fibers were stretching. The electrical conduction system was fraying. He was 31 years old, but his cardiovascular system was that of a man in his 50s. As 1977 drew to a close, the band set their sights on the Holy Grail, the United States of America. For Bon, America represented the ultimate validation. It was the land of his heroes, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. If he could make it there, he wasn't just a Scottish immigrant or an Australian convict. He was a global star. But America is a continent-sized grinder. To tour America, you have to drive for days. You have to play in radio stations at 8 a.m. You have to shake hands with thousands of strangers. Bon looked at the map of America and he didn't see opportunity. He saw a vast, endless road. He saw thousands of hotel rooms that all looked the same. He saw 1,000,000 miles of emptiness that he would have to fill with something. He packed his bags, he packed his notebooks, and he packed his demons. He was boarding a flight to the place that would make him a legend and the place that would accelerate his death. The Highway to Hell was no longer a song title. It was a flight path. But the hell he was flying toward wasn't a mythological underworld of fire and brimstone. It was a very real, concrete labyrinth stretching from coast to coast. The arrival of AC/DC in the United States in the late 1970s was not merely a logistical expansion, it was a psychological confrontation. The acceleration of his decline was fueled by a specific force, the geopathology of the American road. In Europe, the distances were manageable. Cultures shifted every few hundred miles. The food changed, the languages changed, the architecture changed. There was stimulation. America was different. It was a monolith of asphalt. For a band operating at the economy class level of rock stardom, which AC/DC still was in 1978, despite their growing reputation, America was a relentless, homogeneous tunnel. It was a blur of Holiday Inns with identical beige carpets, identical sanitized bathrooms, and identical televisions broadcasting the same inane game shows. It was a diet of diner food, grease, sugar, and caffeine, consumed at 3 a.m. under buzzing fluorescent lights. For a man like Bon Scott, who required constant stimulation to silence the noise in his head, this environment was a sensory deprivation tank. The sheer scale of the continent dwarfed the individual. You could drive for 20 hours through the Midwest and see nothing but cornfields and grain silos. This isolation is the incubator of addiction. In the back of the tour bus or squeezed into a station wagon, Bon was trapped. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't find a local pub to charm the locals because they were on the interstate, miles from civilization. The only escape available was chemical. The drinking habits changed again. In Australia, the drinking was communal, a social lubricant for the pub. In London, it was a warming agent against the damp. In America, it became strictly medicinal. It was an anesthetic against boredom. Bon began to drink with a rhythmic consistency, matching the hum of the tires on the road. He would drink to pass the time. He would drink to sleep. He would drink to wake up. The bottle became his clock, his calendar, and his only friend in a country that felt too big to comprehend. In the midst of this grinding American assault, the band recorded the album Powerage. To the casual listener, Powerage is just another collection of high-voltage boogie-woogie rock. But to the forensic biographer, it is the most important document in Bon Scott's life. It is his suicide note, written in installments. Unlike the cartoonish violence of Dirty Deeds or the sexual bravado of the Jack, the lyrics on Powerage are stripped of their comic book armor. They are raw, bleeding, and profoundly sad. On Down Payment Blues, the mask falls off completely. This is not a song by a rock star. It is a song by a man who feels like a failure. Despite the fame, despite the tours, Bon was cash poor. The band's money was plowed back into the machinery, the lights, the trucks, the crew. Bon was living on a meager per diem. I got holes in my shoes / and I'm way overdue / down payment blues. He sings these lines with a desperate, howling authenticity. He was a man in his 30s, sleeping in cheap motels, unable to afford a house, unable to provide stability for a partner. The primal wound of poverty, the fear of the immigrant boy who had nothing, was screaming at him. He felt like a fraud. He was famous, but he was broke. He was a king with a cardboard crown. In Gone Shootin', he turns the lens on a lover but mirrors himself. This track is perhaps the darkest song AC/DC ever recorded. It is a groove-laden tragedy about a lover addicted to heroin. I stirred my coffee with the same spoon / knew her favorite tune / Gone Shootin'. Bon sings it with a resigned, weary detachment. He isn't judging her. He is observing her. And in observing her addiction, he is mirroring his own. He recognizes the compulsion. He recognizes the way the substance takes priority over the relationship. He is watching a woman choose a needle over him, just as he was choosing the bottle over everyone else. The song is a cry of helplessness. It admits that love is not enough to save an addict. It is a chilling premonition of his own fate, that eventually the chemistry wins. Powerage revealed a Bon Scott who was cracking. The bravado was thinning. The cracks in the Bon persona were visible for anyone who cared to listen. But nobody was listening to the lyrics. They were listening to the guitars. They were head-banging. They were drinking along with him, unaware that the man on the record was begging for a lifeline. As the stakes got higher, the internal dynamic of AC/DC began to shift in a way that further isolated Bon. Malcolm and Angus Young were not just musicians, they were generals. They were driven by a terrifying singular vision of world domination. They were disciplined, they were focused. They viewed the band as a business, a legacy, a war machine. Bon Scott was the wild card. In the early days, his chaos was an asset. It got them headlines. It made them dangerous. But as they moved into the arenas of America where millions of dollars were on the line, chaos became a liability. The young brothers began to worry. They saw Bon missing cues. They saw him stumbling. They saw the glaze in his eyes during the interviews. They were protective of him. They loved him like a brother, but they loved the band more. There were closed-door meetings. There were quiet warnings. Pull it together, Bon. Slow down, Bon. But telling an alcoholic to slow down is like telling a man falling off a cliff to fall slower. He couldn't slow down. The mechanism of his addiction was physiological, not behavioral. His brain chemistry had been altered. He needed the alcohol to function. This created a layer of paranoia in Bon. He began to feel like the bad employee. He felt the eyes of the young brothers on him, watching his intake, judging his stability. This paranoia fed the imposter syndrome. He began to believe that he was replaceable. He knew he wasn't a great musician in the technical sense. He couldn't play guitar like Angus. He couldn't write riffs like Malcolm. He was just the voice, and voices can be replaced. He drank to drown the paranoia, which only made the behavior worse, which only increased the scrutiny. It was a death spiral. By 1979, the pressure was absolute. The record label, Atlantic Records, gave the band an ultimatum: produce a radio hit or get dropped. They brought in a new producer, Robert John Mutt Lange. Mutt Lange was a perfectionist, a sonic architect. He was not interested in the raw, sloppy energy of the pub. He wanted precision. He wanted backing vocals that were in tune. He wanted radio-friendly choruses. The recording sessions for Highway to Hell in London were a torture test for Bon. Mutt Lange pushed Bon's voice to its absolute limit. He demanded take after take. He wanted Bond to learn breathing techniques. He wanted him to sing with melodic control, not just scream. For Bond, whose throat had been battered by years of smoking and spirits, this was physically agonizing, but it was also his finest hour. Under Lange's direction, Bond's voice transformed. It lost some of the drunken slur and gained a razor-sharp cutting edge. Listen to the track, Highway to Hell. The opening scream is not just loud. It is perfectly pitched, perfectly controlled. It is the sound of a man channeling all his pain, all his exhaustion, into a single defiant note. But the lyrics of the album reveal the darkening of his soul, living easy, loving free / season ticket on a one-way ride. It plays as a party anthem. It reads like a suicide note. It is a song about a man who has accepted his damnation. No stop signs, speed limit / nobody's gonna slow me down. It is a declaration of intent. He is not looking for an exit ramp. He knows where the road goes, and he is stepping on the gas. Then there is Touch Too Much. She had the face of an angel / smiling with sin / the body of Venus with arms. It is a song about excess, about having too much of a good thing until it becomes a bad thing. It is the story of his life. He had touched too much fame, too much drink, too much adrenaline, and it was killing him. And finally, the darkness culminates in Night Prowler. This is the final track on the album. It is slow, bluesy, and menacing. Bond sings from the perspective of a predator, a creature of the night. Shazbot, Nanu, Nanu. He ad-libs at the end, quoting the alien Mork from the TV show Mork and Mindy. Even in his darkest, most menacing song, he ends with a joke, a deflection, a reminder that he is just a clown. But the Night Prowler wasn't a monster under the bed. It was the addiction stalking him. It was the shadow self that took over when the sun went down. Before finishing the album in London, the band had spent time in Miami, Florida, the Sunshine State. Photos from this period show a tanned, shirtless Bond. He looks healthy. He looks fit. But this is the last rally, a phenomenon often seen in terminal patients. In Miami, Bond was trying to get clean, or at least cleaner. He was swimming. He was eating better. He was trying to heal the damage of the road. But the liver does not heal in a week. The scarring cirrhosis is a cumulative process. The hepatocytes were dying faster than they could regenerate. The blood flow through the liver was becoming restricted, and the psychological addiction was merely dormant, waiting. There is a story from this period where Bond attended a party. He was trying not to drink heavily, but the social pressure, the expectation to be Bon Scott, was overwhelming. Someone handed him a bottle. The switch flipped. The Bond persona took over. He drank the room under the table. He woke up the next day with the crushing guilt that only an addict knows. The feeling of failure. The feeling that the beast is stronger than the will. It begins with the resolve to stop. This is quickly shattered by social pressure, leading to a binge. The binge results in crushing guilt, which drives him to drink again just to numb the shame. This cycle is the classic engine of alcoholism. In Miami, under the bright sun, Bond realized he couldn't outrun his shadow. By late 1979, Highway to Hell was released. It exploded. It broke the top 20 in the U.S. It was a massive hit. The band embarked on the tour that should have been their victory lap, but for Bond, it was a funeral procession. He was now famous in America. He was recognized in airports. He was wealthy, or at least the money was finally starting to flow. But his personal life was a wasteland. His relationship with Silver Smith, a woman he cared for deeply, was complicated and fractured by distance and substance abuse. He had no home. He lived in suitcases. He wrote letters home to friends in Australia. These letters are heartbreaking artifacts. They are not the letters of a rock god. They are the letters of a lonely, tired man. "I'm so tired," he wrote. "I just want to find a place to settle down, maybe buy a house." He talked about wanting to quit the band. He talked about doing a solo album, something quieter, something less demanding. He talked about getting off the bus. He was fantasizing about a normal life, a life where he didn't have to scream every night, a life where he didn't have to be Bon the Ron. But he was trapped by his own success. The machine was bigger than him now. There were contracts. There were tour dates booked 2 years in advance. There were millions of dollars riding on his throat. He couldn't quit. He was the engine of a juggernaut. As the Highway to Hell tour ground through Europe in late 1979, the physical signs of the end became undeniable to those who looked closely. The bloat was severe. His face was puffy. His abdomen was distended. This is a sign of ascites, fluid accumulation caused by liver failure. His hands shook. In the mornings before the first drink, the tremors were visible. This is the central nervous system firing uncontrollably. Deprived of the sedative effect of alcohol it had become dependent on. He needed a livener, a morning drink, just to hold a razor to shave. His voice was changing too. The high notes were harder to hit. He had to strain. The veins in his neck would bulge dangerously. He was tearing his vocal cords apart every night. Backstage, he was exhausted. He would collapse on sofas, unable to move until stage time. The Energizer Bunny energy of the early days was gone. He was running on pure will and muscle memory. There's a specific, often overlooked detail from the final tour that illustrates his mental state. Bon began to obsess over learning to play the Hammond organ. Why? It makes no sense for the lead singer of a hard rock guitar band to learn the organ. Psychologically, it was a desperate attempt to find a new role. He wanted to be a musician, not just a frontman. He wanted to sit down. He wanted to add something musical to the band, to prove to the young brothers that he had value beyond his ability to scream and jump. He would spend hours tinkering with the keyboard, trying to learn chords. It was a poignant, childlike attempt to reinvent himself before it was too late. He was trying to pivot. He was trying to find a way to age gracefully in a genre that demanded eternal youth. But the band didn't need an organ player. They needed the wild man. Christmas 1979. The tour ended. The band returned to London to prepare for the next album. Bon spent Christmas with his parents, who had traveled to London. It was a brief moment of warmth. But even then, the shadow was there. His parents noticed he looked tired. They noticed he was drinking, but they didn't know how to stop him. He was a grown man, a superstar. You don't tell a superstar to put down the glass. Bon gave his mother a necklace. It was a gesture of love, but also of goodbye. He returned to London in January 1980. The 1980s had arrived. A new decade. The punk movement was dying. New wave was rising. Heavy metal was about to explode. A C/DC was positioned to be the kings of the new era. Bon Scott was standing on the precipice of absolute global dominance. He had survived the poverty of Scotland. He had survived the brutality of the Australian playground. He had survived the prison cell. He had survived the motorcycle crash. He had survived the bloodhouses. He had made it. But the primal wound had not healed. It had festered. And the medicine he had used to treat it, the alcohol, had turned into a poison that had saturated every cell in his body. He was walking around London in early 1980, a dead man walking. His liver was a stone. His heart was a stretched sack. His brain was a chemical storm. All it would take was one final push, one final night where the loneliness became too much, and the bottle offered the only embrace available. That night was coming. And when it finally arrived, it didn't come with a bang, but wrapped in the wet, suffocating fog of a city that felt more like a tomb than a home. The winter of 1980 in London served as a hostile backdrop for Bon Scott, transforming the city into a bleak psychological weight. The freezing dampness was physically aggressive to a man acclimated to the Australian sun, severely aggravating the asthma that plagued him, a vulnerability compounded by chain smoking and substance abuse. Although he had established a residence in Westminster with his girlfriend Silver Smith, the flat felt more like a holding pen than a home, and their relationship remained a volatile anchor in his life. This period marked the dangerous phase of decompression following the Highway to Hell tour. Stripped of the tour's rigid structure and adrenaline, Bon struggled with the terrifying silence that followed. He attempted to adopt a routine of domestic normalcy, but the wild persona he had cultivated was impossible to shed. Despite his efforts to ground himself, he was constantly pulled back into the cycle of excess, unable to escape the only role he truly knew how to play. The creative tragedy of early 1980 lies in the Easy Hire Rehearsal Studios in North London. This is where AC/DC began to assemble the machinery for their next album, the album that would become Back in Black. While the official band history maintains that Bon wrote nothing for the record, the forensic clues and the persistent testimony of friends suggesting otherwise point to a hauntingly different reality. Bon Scott was writing. He was always writing. He carried notebooks with him everywhere, battered, stained exercise books filled with his neat cursive scrawl. These were not just lyric sheets, they were the diaries of a man observing his own decline. In the weeks leading up to February, Bon was sitting in that rehearsal room, listening to the young brothers churn out the monolithic riffs that would define the 80s. He was channeling the darkness of the London winter into words. There are accounts of Bon sitting behind the drum kit, his first love, bashing out rhythms while Angus played the riff for what would likely become Have a Drink on Me. There is a forensic irony in that song, Have a Drink on Me. It is celebrated as a party anthem, but if Bon Scott indeed worked on the embryonic stages of that track, it transforms into a macabre confession. It is the addict offering his own poison to the world. It is a man inviting the listener to join him in the very ritual that is killing him. Whiskey, gin, and brandy / with a glass, I'm pretty handy / I'm trying to walk a straight line / on sour mash and cheap wine. If these sentiments originated in Bon's mind in January 1980, they were not glorifications. They were reportage. He was trying to walk a straight line and he was failing. The neurological damage to his cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls balance and gait, was advanced. His sea legs, which fans attributed to his swagger, were partly a result of ataxia, a condition caused by the degeneration of nerve cells due to chronic alcohol toxicity. He walked with a wide stance because his brain could no longer triangulate his position in space with precision. The band was firing on all cylinders. Malcolm and Angus were disciplined, focused, and hungry. They could sense that the next record would be the breakthrough. They were pushing Bon. We need lyrics, Bon. We need melodies, Bon. The pressure was hydraulic. Bon sat in the corner of the studio, pen hovering over paper, trying to summon the street poet one more time. But the well was poisoned. He was tired. His letters from this period speak of a bone-deep exhaustion. He wasn't just tired of the road. He was tired of being Bon Scott. He was trapped in a feedback loop where his job required him to write about a lifestyle that was physically dismantling him. To write the song, he had to live the life. To live the life, he had to drink. To drink was to die. The mechanism of death did not begin in the car. It began in the lungs. Bon had a history of asthmatic bronchitis. In the warm, dry climate of Australia, this was manageable. In the damp, freezing fog of London, coupled with chain smoking and heavy alcohol consumption, his lungs were in a state of chronic inflammation. Alcohol is a bronchial irritant. It also suppresses the immune system. By February 1980, Bond's respiratory cilia, the tiny hair-like structures that clear mucus and debris from the lungs, were paralyzed by smoke and toxins. His lungs were heavy, wet, and compromised. Furthermore, he was likely taking medication for his nerves or his sleep. The interplay between sedatives and alcohol is lethal. They are both central nervous system depressants. They potentiate each other. 1 + 1 does not equal 2, it equals 5. When a person with compromised lungs and a suppressed CNS drinks heavily, the respiratory drive, the brain's automatic signal to breathe, is weakened. The threshold for apnea is lowered. Bond was walking around with a respiratory system that was already teetering on the edge of failure. He didn't just drink too much on the final night. He poured a central nervous system suppressant into a body that was already struggling to oxygenate itself. He was priming the biological pump for asphyxiation. In the weeks leading up to February 19th, Bond was surrounded by people, yet he was profoundly alone. This is the paradox of celebrity. He had friends everywhere. London was full of people who wanted to buy Bon Scott a drink. They wanted to be near the energy, the fame, the danger. When Bond walked into a pub, whether it was the obscure watering holes of Victoria or the trendy clubs of Soho, he was a magnet. But these were not friends in the therapeutic sense. They were enablers. An enabler does not necessarily mean harm. They are often fans or drinking buddies who simply want to share a moment with their idol. They hand him a double scotch. They cheer when he downs it. They laugh when he stumbles. They interpret his slurred speech as rock and roll charm. They are the chorus in a Greek tragedy, cheering the hero as he walks toward the cliff. Bond's true friends, the young brothers, his family, a few close confidants, saw the reality. They saw the gray skin. They saw the tremors. They tried to intervene in the way men of that era did, with quiet words, with work, with a distraction. Come on, Bond, let's get the track done. But they could not watch him 24 hours a day. The moment Bond left the studio, he was back in the wild, unprotected. There was also the sinister undercurrent of the London drug scene. While Bond was primarily an alcohol man, the circles he moved in were awash with heroin. In early 1980, heroin was cheap and high purity in London. It was the chic drug of the post-punk underground. Did Bond dabble during these final weeks? The forensic likelihood is high. Heroin is the ultimate painkiller. For a man with physical pain and psychic pain, the opiate embrace is seductive. Even if he wasn't a daily user, sporadic use would have lowered his tolerance and sensitized his respiratory system to depression. If he was mixing even small amounts of opiates with massive amounts of alcohol, he was engaging in a game of Russian roulette where 3 of the chambers were loaded. The timeline of the final days is a blur of mundane activities and ominous foreshadowing. On Friday, February 15th, Bond attended a session with the band. They were working through the arrangements. The mood was intense. Bond was struggling with his vocals. The high notes, the trademark screech, were buried under layers of phlegm and inflammation. He was frustrated. He was snapping at people. He spent the weekend trying to rest, but rest for Bond meant restless pacing and maintenance drinking, sipping vodka to keep the shakes at bay. On Monday, February 18th, the day before the end, Bond called his mother, Isa, in Australia. Telephone calls from the dead are often imbued with retrospective meaning, but this call was undeniably heavy. Bond sounded weary. He didn't talk about the new album with excitement. He talked about the future with a vague sense of detachment. He promised to come home for her birthday. "I'll be there, Mum. I promise." It was a promise he couldn't keep. That afternoon, he went to the studio again. He watched Malcolm and Angus work. There is a haunting image of him sitting on a sofa in the control room, watching the brothers through the glass. He wasn't participating. He was observing. It was as if he was already separating from the entity of AC/DC. He was witnessing the machine moving on without him. He left the studio in the early evening. He had plans. The specific catalyst for the events of February 19th was a venue called the Music Machine in Camden Town. It was a converted theater, a cavernous, multi-tiered venue that hosted the rising bands of the new wave of British heavy metal. It was loud, it was sweaty, and it was dark. Bond didn't particularly want to go. He had told the band he was going to have an early night. He needed to rest his voice. But then the phone rang. Or perhaps it was a conversation at a pub earlier in the evening. The details of the specific invitation are shrouded in the fog of memory and history. The invitation was to see a gig at the Music Machine featuring a band called Lonesome No More. It wasn't a headline act, it was just a gig, just noise, just something to do. This is the banality of the tragedy. He didn't go out to celebrate a massive victory. He didn't go out to mourn a massive loss. He went out because he was bored. He went out because the silence of his apartment was louder than the amplifiers. He made the decision to join Alistair Kinnear. Alistair Kinnear was not a villain, nor was he merely a historical footnote. He was a bass player, a fringe member of the London rock scene, a man who knew people who knew people. He was not Bond's best friend. He was an acquaintance. He was a drinking buddy. This distinction is vital. A best friend looks at you and says, "Bond, you look like death, go to bed." A drinking buddy looks at you and says, "Bond, let's get smashed." Kinnear was the ferryman. He drove the chariot, the beige Renault 5. When he picked Bond up, the dynamic was set. Bond was the star. Kinnear was the driver. Kinnear couldn't tell Bon Scott to stop drinking. You don't tell the God of Thunder to put down the hammer, you just try to keep up. The sequence of events at the Music Machine is a study in acceleration. Witnesses recall seeing Bon at the bar. He wasn't drinking beer, he was drinking quadruple scotches. A quadruple scotch delivers approximately 4 units of alcohol in a single glass. If he consumed 4 of these in an hour, he ingested 16 units. The liver, even a healthy liver, can process approximately 1 unit per hour. Bond was flooding his system with ethanol at a rate 16 times faster than his body could eliminate it. The alcohol hit his bloodstream like a sledgehammer. It crossed the blood-brain barrier instantly. First, it hit the frontal lobes. The anxiety disappeared. The primal wound was cauterized. He felt good. He felt like Bond. He was laughing, joking, being the life of the party. Then, as the levels rose, it hit the cerebellum. The ataxia worsened. He started to stumble. He spilled drinks. Then it hit the hippocampus. Memory formation stopped. This is the blackout phase. Bond was still walking and talking, but his brain was no longer recording the events. He was on autopilot. Finally, as the night wore on and the glasses piled up, the alcohol began to saturate the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. This is the primal center of the brain. It controls the heartbeat. It controls the breathing. It controls the gag reflex. In the dark, thumping chaos of the Camden Club, amidst the smoke and the lasers, Bon Scott's brainstem was beginning to shut down. The lights were flickering in the control room of his body. He was seen leaving the club with Kinnear. He was incoherent. He was unable to walk unsupported. This wasn't drunk. This was toxic shock. Kinnear helped him into the Renault 5. The car was small. The seats were vinyl. It was cold. Kinnear drove away from Camden, heading south towards the river. He was driving a dying man. Kinnear drove to Bond's flat at Ashley Court in Westminster first, but confronted with the logistics of the building, stairs, security doors, and the dead weight of an unconscious man, he hesitated. He went around to the passenger side and tried to rouse him. "Bond, we're here. Wake up, mate." Nothing. Bond was in a deep stupor, his muscles flaccid. Kinnear rang the buzzer, hoping Silver would answer. Silence. Faced with the impossibility of dragging Bond inside alone and shivering on the pavement in the freezing London night, he made the fatal calculation. He got back in the driver's seat. He decided to drive to his own place in East Dulwich. It was a long drive, across the river, through the dark, empty streets of South London. Beside him, Bond Scott slumped against the door. His head lolled forward. His breathing was heavy, raspy, the rattle of the bronchial tubes, the sound of the asthma and the fluid beginning to accumulate. The car hummed along the tarmac. Every mile was a mile further away from help. Every minute was a minute closer to the biological tipping point. Bond Scott was leaving the world of the living, not with a scream, but with the quiet hum of a Renault engine and the heater blowing lukewarm air against his freezing legs. That hum would be the last lullaby he ever heard, carrying him across the river into a silence that would last forever. The Renault 5 turned onto Overhill Road in East Dulwich just after 3 a.m. The street was silent, a dormant artery of suburban London lined with terraced houses and sleeping families. It was a world away from the neon and sweat of the music machine, a world of aggressive normalcy that now served as the backdrop for a quiet catastrophe. Alistair Kinnear parked the car outside number 67. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence in the cabin was heavy. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the labored, wet breathing of the man in the passenger seat. Kinnear, fighting his own intoxication, made one final attempt to rouse his passenger. He shook Bond's shoulder. The leather jacket was cold to the touch. "Bond, we're here. Come on, mate. You can't stay here." Bond Scott groaned. It was a guttural, incoherent sound, a signal from a brainstem that was rapidly losing contact with the higher functions of consciousness. His eyes did not open. His head, heavy and loose on his neck, lolled against the window glass. He was in a state of profound stupor, a level of unconsciousness from which he could not be recalled by voice or pain. Kinnear stepped out into the biting air. The temperature was dropping towards freezing. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. The interior light flickered on, illuminating the scene in a harsh, yellow cast. Bond looked peaceful in the way that the heavily sedated look peaceful, slack-jawed, pale, broken. Kinnear tried to lift him, but Bond was dead weight, a dead weight of muscle and bone that seemed heavier than his physical mass should allow. Kinnear, exhausted and unsteady, realized the physics were against him. He could not carry a comatose man up the stairs to his flat. He faced a binary choice, the kind of mundane decision that dictates destiny. He could go inside, call the police, call an ambulance, and trigger a spectacle. Or he could do what they had always done on tour, let the man sleep. The logic of the drunk is a flawed logic. It prioritizes convenience and the avoidance of fuss. Kinnear reasoned that Bond just needed a few hours. He was safe in the car. It was locked. It was parked. Kinnear reached into the car and reclined the passenger seat as far back as it would go. The mechanism clicked. Bond's body slid back into a semi-supine position. But, and this is the critical forensic detail, the Renault 5 was a small car. The seat did not lay flat. It created a bucket shape. Bond's hips were lower than his knees. His torso was angled, but his head, lacking muscle tone, fell forward onto his chest, or perhaps slumped awkwardly to the side against the pillar. Kinnear found a blanket, a heavy traveling rug, and draped it over the singer. He tucked it in, a gesture of care that would ultimately serve as a shroud. He scribbled a note with his address and phone number, just in case Bon woke up disoriented, and left it on the dashboard. He closed the door. The latch clicked shut, a metallic finality. Kinnear walked up the path to number 67, unlocked his front door, and went inside to a warm bed. He left Bon Scott alone in the metal box, wrapped in darkness, at the mercy of his own biology. What unfolded in the freezing Renault 5 was a precise sequence of biological failures. The first aggressor was the cold. Alcohol caused vasodilation, accelerating heat loss until hypothermia slowed his heart. But the true killers were position and poison. As alcohol levels peaked, his throat muscles collapsed. Slumped forward in the cramped seat, his airway kinked, a condition known as positional asphyxia. Then came the aspiration. His stomach rejected the toxic spirits, but because the alcohol had paralyzed his gag reflex, the glottis didn't close. He didn't cough. He simply inhaled acidic fluid into his lungs. This caused immediate chemical drowning. Starved of oxygen, his brain went dark, and his heart stuttered into silence. There was no fire, just a quiet biological shutdown. The sun rose over East Dulwich on Tuesday, February 19, 1980. For 15 hours, Bon Scott lay in plain sight, mistaken for a sleeping drunk. Urban scenery in 1980s London. But inside the car, rigor mortis was locking his body into a curled cramp, and livor mortis was turning his back dark purple. It wasn't until 7 p.m. that Alistair Kinnear finally checked the car. The smell of vomit and stale alcohol hit him first. Bon was cold, hard like wood. Panic seized Kinnear as he raced the dead rock star to King's College Hospital, driving a hearse in all but name. At the hospital, it was a formality. Death by misadventure. But the autopsy revealed the truth. A liver scarred by fibrosis and lungs drowned in fluid. The media screamed, "Rock star drinks himself to death." But a smaller detail was more telling. The removal of his dentures revealed the broken, toothless mouth beneath the snarl. The band almost quit. But urged by Bon's father, they hired Brian Johnson, a man who mirrored Bon's working-class desperation. They recorded Back in Black in the Bahamas, a mourning veil in album form. The ominous bell tolling 13 times in the intro wasn't a gimmick, it was a funeral rite. Decades later, Back in Black is the second best-selling album in history. Bon built the house but died on the doorstep. He wasn't a casualty of a lifestyle, but of trauma, a self-fulfilling prophecy of a man running from his own shadow. Today, a bronze statue in Fremantle depicts the Golden God, but forensic truth demands we remember the beige Renault 5. Bon Scott's death is the ultimate stop in an AC/DC riff, the ghost frequency that plays every time the needle drops. Bon Scott has left the stage, but the echoes of the Hells Bells still resonate, reminding us that fame is sometimes just a glamorous mask, concealing wounds that can never heal. This world still holds countless lost souls, geniuses consumed by the flames of their own talent, and deaths still shrouded in the shadows of unsolved files. Who do you want us to shine the light of truth on next? Leave the name you want us to analyze in the comments below. If you appreciate this raw, unforgiving, and honest footage, please give Bon Scott a like and subscribe to the channel now. Don't forget to turn on notifications because our journey to uncover buried truths has only just begun. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.